He paid for her coffee when her card was declined, not knowing she'd soon offer him a contract marriage. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Today's story is titled, He Paid for Her Coffee When Her Card Was Declined, Not Knowing She'd Soon Offer Him a Contract Marriage. Now, let us return to our main character. The smell of roasted beans and rain-soaked asphalt filled the air as Ethan Miles stood in line at a small coffee shop in downtown Seattle. It was one of those gray mornings when everything felt heavy. The sky, his wallet, even his heart. He had just lost his job at the engineering firm the week before, and his mother's medical bills were piling up faster than he could count. Ahead of him stood a woman dressed simply but elegantly, a beige trench coat, glossy hair tucked neatly behind one ear. She looked calm, confident, the kind of person who did not seem to know what it meant to struggle. The barista read her total, and she slid her card across the counter with a polite smile. A pause. Then the soft but unmistakable sound of rejection. The card declined. Her smile faltered for half a second. She tried again, then again, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. "I am sorry, ma'am," the barista said gently. "It is not going through." Ethan saw the flush of embarrassment spread across her cheeks. The line behind them began to grow impatient. Without thinking, he stepped forward, pulled out his worn debit card, and tapped it on the reader. "It is fine," he said quietly. "It happens to everyone." The woman turned toward him, startled. "You do not have to do that." "I know," Ethan replied with a faint smile, "but maybe I want to." For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other, two strangers sharing an awkward, human moment. She finally nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you. I will pay you back." Ethan waved it off. "It is just coffee." But as she picked up her cup, she hesitated, as if searching for words that would not come. Then she walked away, leaving only the faint scent of jasmine and espresso behind. Later that afternoon, Ethan sat by the hospital window, watching the rain blur the city lights. His mother's breathing machine hummed steadily beside him. He thought about the woman at the cafe, the embarrassment in her eyes, the way her voice trembled when she said thank you. Maybe she had reminded him of himself, pretending to hold everything together while life quietly fell apart. He never expected to see her again. 3 days later, he was back at the same cafe, laptop open, scrolling through endless job listings. His bank account balance glared back at him, barely enough for another week of rent. He rubbed his temples and whispered, "Just one break. That's all I need." "Ethan Miles?" He looked up. The same woman stood before him, but this time she looked entirely different. The trench coat was gone. In its place, a tailored navy suit, a diamond watch, and a confidence that seemed to command the entire room. She smiled faintly. "I thought I would find you here." He blinked, confused. Your card. "Worked perfectly fine later," she said. "I owe you a coffee." She placed a cup on his table, then sat across from him without asking. Her eyes were steady, calculating, yet kind. "I did some checking," she said. "You are an engineer, right? Currently unemployed?" Ethan straightened, wary. "That is right. Why?" The woman leaned forward, her tone calm but deliberate. "My name is Clara Holt. I run Holt Dynamics." Ethan nearly choked. Holt Dynamics was one of the largest tech firms in the state. His old company used to compete for their contracts. "I have a proposal," she continued, sliding a sleek envelope across the table. "It may sound insane, but hear me out. I need to be married temporarily. It is a business requirement, part of a board agreement tied to my inheritance." He stared at her, stunned. "You cannot be serious." "Oh, I am," she replied smoothly. "You helped me when you did not have to. I am offering you the same in return. 6 months. No strings, no romance. Just a legal arrangement. You will be compensated more than enough to take care of whatever you are dealing with." Ethan's chest tightened. His mother's hospital bills, the eviction notice, everything flashed before him. He studied her expression, looking for a hint of mockery, but there was none. Just quiet determination. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Because you did not ask for anything," Clara said. and I am tired of people who only do. The coffee between them had gone cold. Ethan looked down at it, then back at her. In that moment, something in her gaze reminded him of the same flicker of vulnerability he had seen 3 days earlier at the counter. Maybe she was not as unshakable as she seemed. Clara stood, smoothing her jacket. Think about it. My driver will be outside until 8. Their place of the vicinity. She turned to leave, but before walking away, she paused. And Ethan, thank you again for the coffee. As the door closed behind her, Ethan stared at the envelope on the table, his reflection trembling in the glossy surface. Somewhere deep down, he knew whatever he decided next would change everything. That night, the rain returned, tapping softly against Ethan's window, like an unending reminder of the choice waiting for him. The envelope from Clara Holt sat unopened on the kitchen table beside a half-eaten bowl of soup. His mother's medical bills lay scattered beside it, each one stamped with red letters that read, "Pas due." He rubbed his tired eyes, whispering to himself, what kind of man signs a marriage contract with a stranger? The question sounded absurd, but so did watching his mother's condition worsen while he had no way to help. At 7:50, his phone buzzed. A text appeared. Clara, the car is outside. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. Then quietly, he stood, put on his jacket, and slipped the envelope into his pocket. The black sedan moved smoothly through the rain-slick streets until it stopped in front of a towering glass building that glowed against the night. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and perfume. Clara waited at the far end of a minimalist office, standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her hair was tied back, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. I did not think you would come, she said softly. I almost did not, Ethan replied. But then I realized I do not have many options left. Clara studied him for a long second before nodding toward the table. On it lay a thin stack of papers, neatly arranged beside a pen. It is simple. A legal marriage lasting 6 months. Appear with me at 5 public events. Attend 1 family gathering. No personal interference. No physical intimacy. When it is over, we both walk away. Ethan took a deep breath. And in return? In resistance apparent, she met his eyes. You will receive enough to cover your debts, your mother's hospital care, and a financial cushion to start again. He let out a dry laugh. You really plan your life like a contract. It is the only way to survive when everyone wants a piece of you, she answered quietly. This way, no one gets hurt. Ethan picked up the pen, but hesitated. You sound like someone who has been hurt before. Her gaze flickered just for a second, then hardened again. Sign it, Ethan, or walk away, but do not pity me. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the rain against the glass. Finally, he signed. Clara exhaled, as if releasing something she had been holding for too long. Good. We will have the ceremony tomorrow at noon. Private, quick, legal. Ethan gave a half smile. Romantic. Efficiency is its own kind of romance, she said dryly, gathering the papers. The next day, they stood side by side in a quiet courthouse chamber. The officiant read the words of the vow, and before Ethan could process it fully, he was sliding a simple gold band onto her finger. Her hand was steady, his was not. Congratulations, the officiant said. You are now husband and wife. Outside, the drizzle had turned to sunlight. Clara turned toward him, her tone measured but her eyes unreadable. Welcome to your new life, Mr. Miles. There's set of lows, and as genation and we nether bleem without back in there. With ever walks is other c/shame. Ethan looked at her, trying to understand what exactly he had stepped into. Somewhere between pity, duty, and curiosity, something else stirred something unfamiliar. As they walked toward the waiting car, he glanced back at the courthouse doors, half expecting the world to laugh at him. But all he heard was the steady rhythm of her heels beside him and the soft echo of his own voice repeating silently in his head. 6 months. Just 6 months. What could possibly go wrong? The mansion looked like something out of a magazine, white stone columns, tall glass doors, and a fountain that whispered over marble steps. As the car stopped in front, Ethan felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He followed Clara up the steps, trying not to stare too long at the golden fixtures that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and quiet money. A butler in a crisp black uniform opened the door wider, bowing slightly. Welcome home, Mrs. Holt. Mr. Miles. The words hit him harder than expected. Mr. Miles, husband. He was not sure he would ever get used to that. Clara walked ahead without hesitation, heels clicking on the marble floor. You will be staying in the East Wing, she said evenly. My staff has prepared a room for you. Dinner is at 7 sharp. Dress appropriately. Ethan frowned slightly. You make it sound like boot camp. It is Ras is the problem in abrading with a possin. She paused, half turning toward him. Discipline keeps people from asking too many questions. Then she walked away. His room was larger than his entire apartment. A balcony overlooked the city skyline, and a chandelier hung above a bed that looked too perfect to sleep in. He placed his worn duffel bag on the corner and muttered, 6 months, Ethan. Keep your head down. That night, the dining hall felt endless. Clara sat at the far end of a long table, perfectly composed, slicing into her dinner with precision. Between them stretched a silence heavy enough to touch. Ethan tried to start a conversation. So, what exactly am I supposed to do besides show up to events and smile? And, do not talk about the contract in public, she replied without looking up. And do not improvise, every appearance is planned. He leaned back in his chair. You really do not trust anyone, do you? Her fork froze for a second before she set it down gently. Trust is expensive, Mr. Miles. I learned that early. The next morning began with what Clara called orientation. A stylist arrived with racks of tailored suits, followed by a speech coach who corrected Ethan's posture, his handshake, even his smile. Each correction chipped away at the comfortable sarcasm he used to hide behind. By the third day, his reflection looked like someone else entirely. The simple engineer was gone. In his place stood a man in a fitted suit who knew which fork to use first at a formal dinner. Still, every time he caught Clara watching him from across the room, something in her gaze made him uneasy. It was not judgment, it was curiosity. That evening, they sat across from each other in the study, going over the guest list for an upcoming charity gala. Clara leaned forward, tapping a name with her pen. This event will be the first time the board sees us together. You cannot afford mistakes. Ethan smiled faintly. And what counts as a mistake? Anything real, she said. He looked at her then, really looked, noticing the faint exhaustion beneath her flawless composure. You know, for someone who hates pretending, you are very good at it. Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something close. Maybe that is why I needed you. You are terrible at pretending. For the first time since they met, the tension broke. She let out a soft laugh, quick, surprised, almost human. Ethan found himself laughing too. I will take that as a compliment. Do not, she replied, standing to leave, but her voice had softened. Good night, Ethan. As the door closed behind her, Ethan stared at the empty chair across from him. Somewhere in the quiet hum of that grand, lonely house, he realized that their 6-month contract was already becoming something neither of them had planned for. The night of the charity gala arrived like a storm wrapped in diamonds. Every guest who entered the ballroom gleamed under the chandelier light, their laughter echoing off marble walls. Ethan adjusted his tie for the 5th time, his palms slick with nerves. Across the room, Clara stood surrounded by reporters and executives, every inch the poised CEO. Her gown was midnight blue, her expression unreadable. But when her eyes met his across the crowd, something flickered acknowledgement, maybe trust. The public introduction of their marriage was the first real test. Cameras flashed as Clara took his arm. Just smile and stand straight, she whispered through the curve of her painted lips. They can smell fear. He forced a steady grin. I build bridges, Clara. I can handle a ballroom. As they walked in together, murmurs rippled through the guests. People whispered about the mysterious husband no one had met, the ordinary man from nowhere who had somehow captured the city's most elusive heiress. Ethan felt the weight of every stare but kept his focus on her. During the dinner, an older board member leaned over with a smirk. So, Mr. Miles, how does it feel to marry above your tax bracket? The table went silent. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked directly at the man and said calmly, If you are lucky, someday someone might love you for who you are, too. The tension snapped into laughter from nearby tables. Even Clara's lips twitched before she looked away, pretending not to be impressed. Later that evening, a reporter cornered Clara for an interview. Some say this marriage was rushed. What made you so certain about him? Clara hesitated, then glanced toward Ethan, who was helping an elderly guest find her seat. Her answer came softer than expected. Sometimes certainty is not about logic. It is about timing. It is mal to cap out. Ethan did not hear her words, but when he turned back and saw the warmth in her eyes, something in his chest shifted. After midnight, the music slowed, and the crowd began to thin. Ethan found her standing alone near the balcony, the city glittering behind her. "I survived," he said, stepping beside her. "No spilled wine, no fainting, no bad jokes." "You did well," she replied, her tone light but sincere. "Better than I expected. High praise coming from you." They stood in silence for a while, the hum of distant traffic filling the space between them. Then Clara spoke quietly, almost to herself. "My father used to bring me to events like this. He would always remind me that everyone smiling at you wants something." Ethan looked at her profile, the faint sadness hidden behind her strength. "What do you want, Clara?" She turned to face him, her voice steady but low. "Peace." For a moment, the polished walls and expensive lights disappeared, leaving just the two of them, two people who had built fortresses around their hearts for different reasons. When the car brought them back to the mansion, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was charged, fragile, human. As they reached the grand staircase, Clara stopped. "Tomorrow there will be stories in the papers," she said softly. "Ignore them. They do not define us." Ethan nodded. "Then what does?" She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "What we choose next." Then she turned and disappeared down the hallway, her heels fading into silence. Ethan stood alone in the vast foyer, the echo of her words lingering. He realized that what had begun as a contract had already started to feel like something far more dangerous, something real. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the mansion, painting golden stripes across the marble floor. Ethan stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying and failing to work the espresso machine. The staff had the day off for the company retreat, leaving him alone in a space that smelled faintly of cedar and silence. Clara entered, already dressed in a tailored gray suit. She stopped at the sight of him wrestling with the machine. "That poor appliance looks terrified," she said, the corner of her mouth curving slightly. He laughed under his breath. "I can rebuild a suspension bridge, but I cannot seem to make coffee without breaking the laws of physics." She walked over, pressed a button, and the machine hummed to life. Sometimes all it takes is a lighter touch. He watched her carefully pour 2 cups, her movements precise, graceful. "You say that like it is about more than coffee." "Conception raw, but maybe it is," she replied, handing him a cup. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, and it felt like static in the air. Later that afternoon, they attended a board luncheon at Holt Dynamics headquarters. Ethan had been warned that this one would be more difficult, less glamorous than a gala, but filled with people who would love nothing more than to see Clara fail. The conversation around the long mahogany table began smoothly, until one director, a tall man with silver hair named Richard Holt, leaned forward with a practiced smile. "It is remarkable how quickly you found a husband, Clara. The timing was almost strategic. It is the paid in Lee." Clara's expression did not change, but her hand tightened around her glass. "Is there a question in that, Richard?" "Only curiosity," he replied smoothly. "You always said marriage was a distraction. Now here you are conveniently married right before the inheritance clause takes effect." Ethan's jaw clenched. He could see the tension in Clara's posture, the way she hid discomfort behind elegance. Before she could respond, he spoke up. "Maybe it was not about convenience," Ethan said evenly. "Maybe she just met someone worth changing her mind for." The room went quiet. Richard studied him with thinly veiled disdain, then gave a polite laugh. "How romantic. And many a game to a god of pawn of tacket." Clara glanced at Ethan, her eyes sharp with both gratitude and warning. After the meeting ended, she pulled him aside in the corridor. "You did not need to defend me," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "They should not talk to you like that." Her gaze softened for the briefest moment before she looked away. "You will learn that in this world, perception is more powerful than truth." That evening, the mansion felt warmer than usual. Clara joined him on the balcony, her hair loosened from the tight bun she always wore. The city lights flickered below like distant constellations. "Do you ever wish you could start over?" Ethan asked quietly. She sipped her wine. "Every day. But starting over means admitting that something broke." He nodded, leaning against the railing. "Then maybe we fix it instead." She turned toward him, studying his face as though trying to decide whether he meant it. "You make things sound simple." "Maybe it is simple," he said. You just have to stop pretending." For a heartbeat, she did not answer. Then she smiled, a real one this time, small and unguarded. "Good night, Ethan." As she walked away, he realized that for the first time since the contract began, she had said his name like it meant something. Inside the quiet house, the line between arrangement and affection began to blur, and neither of them seemed willing to pull it back into focus. The weeks that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm neither of them had planned for. What began as an act of survival slowly turned into something that felt dangerously close to comfort. Ethan and Clara fell into an unspoken routine: morning coffee, shared car rides, quiet dinners that stretched a little longer than necessary. The contract was still in place, but somewhere between the lines, they had started writing something new. One Friday evening, a thunderstorm rolled through the city. Clara returned home later than usual, her hair damp, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her purse. Ethan looked up from the couch. "You are soaked. What happened?" "Board meeting," she said, her voice tired. "Richard cornered me again. He wants to challenge my position at the next review." Ethan stood, grabbing a towel. "Sit down. You are shivering." She hesitated but did as he said. He gently draped the towel over her shoulders, careful not to meet her eyes for too long. "You do not have to face this alone, you know." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she just watched him, eyes softer than usual. "You really do not understand the world I live in," she said quietly. "Kindness is often mistaken for weakness." "Maybe," Ethan replied, sitting across from her. "But sometimes strength is knowing when to let someone care." The power flickered. For a moment, the room dimmed, and the only sound was the rain pounding against the tall windows. Clara looked around the vast living room that had always felt too big, too empty. "When my father died," she said suddenly, "I promised myself I would never depend on anyone again. I built walls so high that even I could not see over them." Ethan leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You do not have to keep them up forever." They were access here. Her breath caught, and she looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. Not as her hired husband, not as the man who had signed her contract, but as someone who saw her without judgment. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ethan stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and heavy with petrichor. Clara joined him a few minutes later, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you?" she replied, handing him a mug. "I cannot seem to turn my mind off tonight." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that is because you finally let it feel something." Clara stared out at the glistening skyline. "You talk like you have everything figured out." "I do not," he said simply. "But I know this pretending does not fix loneliness. It just hides it." The silence that followed was different this time, warmer, full of the things they could not yet say aloud. Finally, she turned toward him. "Ethan, when this is over, when the contract ends, what will you do?" He looked at her, the faint glow of the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "I have not thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Maybe I will start over somewhere quiet. Maybe I will finally breathe." Clara nodded slowly, her gaze lowering to her cup. "And what if I asked you to stay?" The lofted downers. He did not answer, but the question lingered between them like the taste of rain in the air. Sweet, uncertain, impossible to ignore. As the night deepened, the distance between them closed inch by inch, not through words, but through understanding. For the first time since the ink had dried on their agreement, Ethan realized the most dangerous part of the contract was not breaking it. It was falling in love with the woman who had written it. 2 weeks later, the warmth that had quietly grown between them was suddenly tested. The morning news played softly in the kitchen as Ethan poured coffee, but his hand froze when he heard Clara's name. "Breaking story," the anchor said. "Documents leaked from inside Holt Dynamics suggest that CEO Clara Holt's recent marriage may have been staged to secure her late father's inheritance." Ethan's stomach turned cold. The broadcast showed photos of him and Clara at the gala, the headline bold beneath it, "Fake love, real power play." Clara appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, her phone already lighting up with calls. She looked at the screen, then at him. "It is Richard," she said flatly. "He finally did it." Ethan set the cup down. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that the board is calling for an emergency session. They think I used you to manipulate the company." Her voice was steady, but her eyes trembled with something she refused to call fear. He took a step closer. Then tell them the truth. I cannot, she said sharply. If I admit we started as a contract, everything collapses. The company, my father's legacy, everything. The silence between them stretched thin. Ethan swallowed hard. So what happens to me? Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. You will be fine, Ethan. You always find a way. He frowned. You are pushing me away again. Because it is safer that way, she snapped. For both of us. Before he could respond, her phone rang again. She turned away to answer, her voice slipping into that practiced tone she used at board meetings, calm, confident, controlled. But Ethan could see through it now. Behind every perfectly measured word was panic. By noon, the mansion was filled with reporters outside the gates and lawyers inside the study. Clara spent hours behind closed doors, pacing, arguing, trying to contain the scandal. When she finally emerged, exhaustion had replaced her usual poise. They want me to step down temporarily, she said quietly. Richard is taking over as interim CEO until the review. Ethan clenched his fists. You cannot let him do that. He set you up. I know, she whispered, eyes glistening. But without proof, it is his word against mine. He watched her crumble in silence, the woman who had once seemed untouchable now breaking under the weight of her own walls. Later that night, he found her sitting alone in the garden, the rain-soaked air heavy with the scent of roses. You should not be out here, he said softly. I used to come here with my father, she murmured. He said this garden was where he thought best. Now it just feels empty. Ethan sat beside her. Then let us fill it again. She looked at him, her eyes tired but tender. You do not have to stay, Ethan. When this gets worse, and it will, you should walk away. He shook his head. That is not how I was raised. You needed someone real beside you, remember? That has not changed. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the trees, and somewhere distant, thunder rolled again. Clara finally whispered, if the truth comes out, they will think you were part of the lie. Then let them, Ethan said quietly. At least this time it will be for something real. Clara turned toward him, tears catching the faint light. For the first time since the storm began, she let him hold her. Not as her husband by contract, but as the one person who refused to let her fight alone. And as the rain began to fall again, Ethan knew the promise he had made to himself to keep his head down and his heart closed was already broken beyond repair. The next morning, the city woke to chaos. News outlets replayed the leaked footage on repeat, and social media was ruthless. Every headline painted Clara as a fraud and Ethan as a willing accomplice. Reporters swarmed the gates of the Holt estate, their microphones reaching through the iron bars like claws. Ethan watched it all from the window, anger burning quietly in his chest. Clara stood behind him, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with her attorney. Her voice was calm, but her shoulders trembled. When she finally hung up, she said, Richard called for a full board hearing tomorrow. If I do not show evidence that this marriage was genuine, I will lose everything. Ethan turned to face her. Then we will find proof. She shook her head. He covered his tracks too well. Every document, every transfer, it is airtight. Ethan frowned, thinking hard. Then he remembered something Richard's smug grin at the board meeting weeks ago, the way he had boasted about his private offshore accounts. What if we go after his finances? Clara hesitated. That would take months, maybe years. And even if we did, it will not, Ethan interrupted. Remember your father's charity division? All donations over a certain amount go through an internal database. If Richard has been using company money for himself, it will be there. For the first time in days, hope flickered in Clara's eyes. You think you can find it? I can try, he said. I used to design data tracking systems. If I can get access to the archive, I can pull every transaction he tried to bury. That night, while the rest of the house slept, Ethan worked in Clara's office. The blue light of the monitor illuminated his face as he sifted through thousands of entries, cross-checking donations, transfers, and coded payments. Hours passed, his eyes ached, but he kept going until finally there it was. A series of wire transfers marked as charitable donations, funneled directly to Richard's private investment accounts. Ethan stared at the screen, disbelief giving way to relief. Got you, he whispered. He printed everything, records, dates, signatures. Clara entered quietly, her eyes red but alert. When she saw the papers spread across the desk, she covered her mouth. Ethan, this is proof. He nodded, sliding the folder toward her. It is time to fight back. The next morning, the boardroom was silent as Clara entered, dressed in black, her posture steady. Richard sat at the head of the table, confident, ready to watch her fall. Before we begin, Clara said, her voice clear and controlled, I would like to submit new evidence. She placed the documents on the table. One by one, the board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from boredom to shock as they read. Richard's smirk vanished. This is absurd. You cannot prove those are real. Ethan stepped forward from the doorway. Actually, I can. I traced the IP logs. Every transaction originated from your terminal, Richard. Every one of them. Gasps filled the room. The chairman turned toward Richard, face pale. Is this true? Richard stammered, but the words would not come. Clara's voice broke through the chaos, steady and sharp. You accused me of lying to save my company, but it was you who sold it piece by piece. Consider this, my last act as your CEO. The room erupted into murmurs. Security approached Richard as he stood, red-faced, sputtering threats. Clara watched him go with a calm that felt almost holy. When the meeting adjourned, she walked out into the bright morning light. Ethan close behind. For the first time in weeks, her hands were no longer shaking. She turned to him and whispered, You saved me. Ethan smiled softly. No, Clara. You saved yourself. I just reminded you how. And win it out, man. And as they stood together beneath the tall glass tower that once represented everything fake in their lives, both of them realized that the contract which began their story had finally ended, replaced by something far more real than either had expected. 1 month later, the storm had finally passed. The tabloids that once hunted them now printed apologies in small letters, and the Holt Dynamics logo gleamed again over the city skyline. Clara was reinstated as CEO after the board cleared her name, and Richard faced charges for fraud and embezzlement. Justice had found its way back, though it came with scars. Ethan sat by the window of the same coffee shop where it had all begun, a cup of black coffee cooling between his hands. The city moved outside the glass, normal, quiet, almost forgiving. For the first time in years, he felt free from the weight of survival. The contract was over. His mother's treatment was paid, his debts cleared, and the agreement that had started everything had expired 2 days ago. He wondered if Clara would come. He did not reach out first. She deserved space to breathe, to rebuild without obligation. But part of him still listened for the sound of her voice in every footstep that passed the cafe door. Then he heard it. Still drinking the same blend? Ethan turned. Clara stood there, no longer the untouchable CEO wrapped in power and distance. She wore a soft cream coat, her hair loose, her smile real. She sat down without waiting for an invitation. I thought you might come back here, she said, glancing around. You always said this place made you feel grounded. He smiled faintly. It is where you nearly lost your coffee and your patience. And where you paid for both, she replied. For a moment, silence settled between them, but it was no longer awkward. It was warm, full of everything they did not need to say aloud. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. Before I sign off on any new contracts, I thought I should return this one. Ethan opened it and found the old coffee receipt, the one from the day they met, encased in clear plastic. At the bottom, written in Clara's neat handwriting, were the words, Debt repaid with interest. He looked up, his voice quiet. Interest? She smiled, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, simple but elegant. This time no terms, no signatures, just a promise. Ethan's breath caught. Are you sure about this? For the first time in my life, she said, I am sure of something that has nothing to do with business. This not as say be, intel get it a dilden, in leader has Rosses. He took her hand, his thumb brushing against her fingers. Then I guess I owe you another coffee. Clara laughed softly. You always did. Outside, sunlight streamed through the window, cutting across the table in golden lines. The world beyond the glass no longer felt divided between rich and poor, power and weakness. It just felt real. Ethan raised his cup slightly, toasting the space between them. To honesty, he said. Clara met his gaze, her eyes bright. To beginnings. As they sat there, the bell above the cafe door chimed again. The same sound that had once marked an accident and now signaled everything they had fought for. The contract that started with desperation ended in choice, and the love that began with a lie became the truest thing either of them had ever known. Because in the end, it was never about money or status. It was about a cup of coffee, a moment of kindness, and two people brave enough to turn a transaction into a lifetime.